you so much. I think actually I didn't know the results of Massimo presentation, but I think like are a great introduction for what I'm gonna do here. And this is like a joint paper with like Eliana Ferrara, in which we study online tutoring. Started during the pandemic, but still like if there are teachers in the audience, this is like a project that is still ongoing. And so we are still trying to offer this type of like services to as many schools as possible in Italy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. But like I think I don't need to spend much time after Massimo's presentation, but like here, since the beginning of the pandemic, there was the perception that school closure would have like a strong impact on student learning, like everybody would expect that. And there was overall like the overwhelming like worry across like policymakers around the world that this would affect in particular low SES kids that would have like not enough support from their parents, not enough like devices like to get connected. They didn't know like how to move forward. And so there are a bunch of like literature review at this point that shows that the average learning loss was around 0.70 standard deviation, but like much higher for like a student from low SES background, and some work showing the adverse psychological effects of the pandemic. So what we did in this project is thinking about like very early on. It was the first month when school closed. And together with Eliana Ferrara, my co-author, we were like, actually I was in the US at that point, she was in Italy, and we were like, Italy was one of the first countries to shut down like schools, and we were like, this is gonna affect negative students. And we don't want to be writing like in 2 years from now a paper showing like how big the learning loss. We actually did, but like, this was like, this is gonna happen, we know that it's gonna happen, what can we do today to try to prevent this learning loss to happen, especially for low SES students. And so coming like we try to check like to think about the literature on that domain, and like, one of the most effective intervention that we know works around the world is like tutoring, providing like one-to-one tutoring to individuals. And this is like indeed this is what happened like right after like in the US, for example, there are 28 billion that were set right after, like in the middle of COVID, for like a one-to-one or a small group tutoring for students. But like I can tell you, like all over the world, I had like been in touch with like policymaker. Chile just like implemented like a large scale tutoring for more than with the idea of reaching like substantially 50% of the student population in the entire country. This is like a government policy implemented. So what we did was indeed like launching this like online tutoring program. I'm gonna tell you why online program in like a couple of slides, and we are still doing it. Right now we've got like in Italy more than 4,000 students that participate in this like one-to-one tutoring program, and we have been in touch with several policymakers all over the world, but especially Latin American countries, that were very interested in scaling this project, and we had a version of that in Brazil and a version in the Dominican Republic that we have been like piloting like over time with like local governments. So the target of the program is especially middle school students from disadvantaged background. This is like mainly in terms of like socioeconomic status, but also like language barriers, and a lot of our students do have some form of like learning difficulties or learning disabilities. The program, even today, we are actually just randomized, like, and I'm going to tell you why we are still randomizing, but we just got the new assignment of like 500 tutors to students like on Friday for this year. It still had completely online. During the lockdown, the first wave that I'm going to show you today, in-person interaction were not possible. But even nowadays, like our tutors are volunteer university students. Why? Because the problem of like tutoring is that it's like one of the most costly type of experiment that you can think about. It's like the most effective, but it's also the most costly, because you're giving like a teacher one-to-one to each of your students. So great, it's like effective, but we need to find a way to make it like cost effective and be able to like reach disadvantaged students. And so what we developed over time thanks to the support of like Bicocca University, was a training of university students as volunteers to support disadvantaged kids. This has like the advantage of like lower costs, as we were discussing, but also our volunteer university students are extremely motivated, with extremely intrinsic motivated to try to help like these disadvantaged kids. And they try to build up like a very close relationship between the two teams. For example, like our program, like the target was to have like around like 3 hours for 12 weeks, so 36 hours. Actually, surprisingly close to your estimate, but I didn't know that. I didn't know you were exactly about to talk about that. But like, so this was our goal, to get as close as possible to this type of like intervention. But like, yeah, the idea is that it was really like building a lot, but like they are university student volunteers, but also with the support of trained pedagogical experts. And this is very important. I can talk later, like if there are more questions about like child protection policy, but clearly this has been like a top concern for us, and we have like a strong team that is behind it to try to prevent any accident to happen. And now it's like the 6th edition of the program, and we didn't have any serious accident that happened, still like a lot of control from the pedagogical experts. So the first year we randomized because we had, essentially, we set up the program in 3 weeks. And our team of pedagogical experts are like, we can't train more than 500 volunteers, we can support them. We had more than 2,000 university students that signed up to volunteer for this program in 24 hours, the first year we implemented the program. And we had more than 1,000 students that were selected by their own teachers as a student in need for this program. We tried to put a cap of like 3 students per class in order to avoid having like the entire class selected and those students that don't need potentially the program. And so something that we exploit for our study is in the first year we randomized whether students were assigned to 3 or 6 hours of individual tutoring. It was a time of the school closure, spring 2020, and we had a bunch of volunteers that were willing to volunteer 6 hours per week to help these university students. In 2022, actually now we can have like so many volunteers. We still have like more than 1,000 volunteers every year, so it's like the number is still like very high. Especially because we are concentrated in around 10 universities, but like around like those that complete the child protection policy and the training, we get to around 600 volunteers that we could match with the tutors. But on the other hand, like more schools started to get to know the program, they wanted to get their students selected. So we had like more than 2,500 applicants from the school side that wanted to participate. And so we try to make it more efficient, randomizing individual versus small group tutoring. Because we want, if like small group tutoring is as effective as individual tutoring, we could reach with the same amount of tutors more students over time. So this is what I'm going to show you for the 2022 edition. Over time we have the other years, but then like there is always a lag in when we get to the administrative data and we can evaluate the fact, but we keep on the evaluation because we still have more students that are selected by schools compared to tutors that we can match. But we try to give it to as many students as possible every year moving forward. Okay, so let me jump on the results. I'm going to show you results on 4 dimensions. So the first one is in terms of like academic outcomes and beliefs. Here I'm going to use like mainly at this point administrative data. We have data on the teacher assigned grades and a standardized test score that allows us to evaluate the causal effect of this program by comparing the students that are assigned to the tutor, that apply to the program and are assigned to the tutor, to the students that apply to the program and are not assigned to a tutor during that academic year. But also we have 3 other set of questions that I think are very important for us, that is trying to think about how did the tutoring affect the aspiration of these students. In most of like, the cases, these are students that don't know anyone that went to university in their network. And so now they get to interact very closely for 12 weeks with someone that is attending university. And so for them, it could be a sort of like aspiration effect, so at least this was like our theory of change in mind. we see the effect on social-emotional skills, whether they became like more perseverant over time, and the well-being that we believe is particularly important during the school closure when they didn't have any interaction with people outside their house. And so having the tutor that was entering their house through the computer was a sort of like a way to getting some exposure, external exposure. Let me show you one figure with the main results. Here I'm showing you 3 sets of academic outcomes for the 3 hours individual tutoring. So it's not the overall effect of 2020, 2022, but just try to disentangle the effect of being assigned to 3 hours individual tutoring per week to make it comparable across different waves. So in both ways we kept one treatment arm that was exactly the same. And so what you see is that overall there are positive results, more noisy in terms of standardized test score. So you see 0.1, 0.07 standard deviation in 2020 and 2022 on teacher assigned grades. The probability of not failing, so during the COVID pandemic, all the grades were lifted up, so it was more difficult to pick up an effect. In 2022, we see this larger effect. So this is the main difference, even if it's not statistically significant. In terms of test score, where we have more power to pick up effects, the effect of 3 hours individual tutoring is between 0.15 and 0.2 standard deviation. So very substantial effect for 3 months of intervention, substantially, for these disadvantaged students. The part that for me was a bit, I was happy of, but that was surprising, it was not necessarily the case that the effect should be exactly the same in 2020 and 2022. 2020 schools were closed, there was no interaction in person, while in 2022 the online tutoring was happening during normal school interaction. And still, we find very positive effects that pushed us to think we needed to keep working with this project because otherwise, we're taking we have the possibility to create these matches, and we are not doing that. So the final part of the paper tried to understand from a conceptual framework the mechanism, thinking about the dosage, the 3 versus 6 hours of tutoring, the tailored instruction. There is a lot of literature at teaching at the right level, so essentially having an individual one-to-one tutor, especially online, will help you targeted instruction compared to having a group setting, even if in our case we're very small groups. And then we see the effect on mentorship with the other non-academic outcomes that I told you about. So here you see the effect comparing the intense treatment with the 3 hours. So essentially for the intense treatment you need to sum up these 2 coefficients. For the test score, the effect is more than double if you have 6 hours of intense treatment compared to 3 hours per week. And this is very consistent with the literature. The literature really push to have intense tutoring when you are doing it instead of diluting it over time. And so we find very consistent results. And again, also in grades and the probability of failing, it goes in the same direction, but we have more power on the standardized test. Second aspect is the customized instruction, individual versus group tutoring. If anything, the effects are never statistically significant, but they always go in the negative direction. With for example, 0.21 standard deviation for the 3 hours individual tutoring, and if you sum up the 2, you have 0.08 standard deviation of the group interaction. So the effect is less than half in the test score of having a group interaction compared to a one-to-one tutor that pushed us to drop this channel, this mechanism over time, so we are not doing group tutoring anymore. And finally, this is the effect on the other set of more non-cognitive outcomes, and you see both the effect in 2020 and 2022. And I think here the big takeaway is that all these dimensions were extremely positive during COVID, and then it got to 0 afterwards. In our training, we didn't have any component in helping tutors to improve the social-emotional well-being of their students. And this was another thing that during the pandemic, it may have been enough to just have some interaction. Without that additional training, we don't find any effect on the normal time. As it pushed us to think harder on this for the future edition. One last result, and then I'm going to close, But we also, in the first year, given that we have so many tutors that apply, we randomized the tutor that got matched with their tutees. And so we could see the effect on the tutors themselves. And we find very strong effect on their empathy index, so essentially their ability to get in the shoes of others. And this was driven especially from those tutors that were matched with like, immigrants or low SES kids, like particularly low SES kids. Let me close here. So we believe that this online tutoring may have like a potential even today to help like reach students, because all our university students are based in large cities. And now, like, thanks to the online setting, they can volunteer helping a student that is in a remote area that otherwise would not have access to a university tutor. And so this is the reason why we are still like keeping it online. It's highly cost effective, like more or less $50 per student. In the first edition, it got higher, close to 100, because now we have a higher standards in terms of like child protection over time, but like it's still like very limited for this impact in terms of standard deviation. And yeah, let me close here because I know I'm running out of time. So do one.